Breath of the Wild is one of the most critically praised and well-known games of the last decade. The console release for the Switch is one of the most successful Nintendo consoles to date. An incredibly well-crafted and well-designed game that utilizes a well-forgotten game design tactic that I think has moved more from the AAA space to the indie area. While Breath of the Wild is not flawless, it is still one of the most beloved games even to this day on the Switch and just overall. Many AAA games coming out today are released in rather unpolished states with lackluster content and even held back content for monetization later on. Breath of the Wild was a game that harkens back to the older times of gaming, with a more true focus on the experience of the game and quality over the front-facing aspect. Without looking into the depths of Nintendo and how awful of a company they can be more times than not, the whole copyright fiasco of many years past and now the present, and how vile they are against some of their biggest fans, Breath of the Wild and its games are a testament to the ability of the developers to create fantastical experiences. When a sequel to Breath of the Wild was announced back in 2019, it had massive expectations to undertake and overtake if it ever reached past the shadows of its predecessor. One of the most acclaimed games to release in the past decade, it would not be an easy task for anyone. But with its release date set, it was finally released. Before any of that, I will say this will mostly be a spoiler-free experience. I will talk about some of the gameplay elements, but I will be vigilant to keep spoiler-free from this video. I'm not going to be going too deep into anything about the game, only about the first 5 to 10ish hours, which is only the first few areas for me. Nothing that will ruin major story elements, but gameplay spoilers will be happening. I know a lot of people want to play this game or not, and know if it's worth playing. The short answer is yes. The long answer is a bit more complicated, but still yes, per usual I guess. I do think it is worth the price of admission if you liked or loved Breath of the Wild. Well, anyways, let's not dawdle much longer. I do want to talk about sequels in general at some point. I don't want to harken on this topic too much longer. But a final warning, if you don't want to be spoiled on anything too early in the game with gameplay elements or area elements or whatever, then please skedaddle out of here and enjoy the game for yourself. Otherwise, if you just don't care or you know a bit, then you'll be perfectly fine. Let's finally delve into what a sequel really is and what makes a good sequel a good successor. Well, a sequel is pretty straightforward to what it should be on the surface. But sequels can be a bit more complicated when we start to think more about them on a whole. You see, a sequel to me has many different forms. From a direct sequel that takes place in the same universe and settings, and sometimes takes place either directly, after or before, a prequel as it's called, the previous game, or a few years after. Most of the time it focuses on the same characters, on their journey towards whatever it may be. Just something even like a spiritual successor, something that doesn't take place in the same setting or even in the same franchise, but utilizes many of the same fundamental ideas as its predecessor had. Sequels can hold many different forms that so offer different experiences from each other. Tears of the Kingdom is in contrast a pretty direct sequel, taking place only a couple to a few years after the ending of the Breath of the Wild. It utilizes many of the same characters and even the same world as its predecessor had. Now, there were many different arguments against Tears of the Kingdom before it was even released, claiming to be basically a DLC and not much else besides a DLC-sized expansion. Stretched out to be a $70 game. Wow, in the current gaming ecosystem, I don't think this is really such a wild claim to make, but 6 years in the making and not much shown gives people a lot of worries and both a lot to work on with when trying to belittle a game before it comes out. While some games deserve some sussiness about them and some suspicions about their actual quality, I think mostly for a lot of games it's not warranted. And even while it's not even released and there's not a lot of information to go on. But no matter what, Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel. So before we really get into the nitty-gritty of what it does towards its predecessor, let's talk about what a direct sequel should do and what an overall sequel should be in terms of the gameplay and overall game feel experience. As I've said, a sequel has many different forms, but there are a few things I feel that almost all of them have that make them both a worthy successor and a good sequel in general. Gameplay is of course one of the biggest elements that almost all sequels should share, not in the form of similar gameplay, but building upon what the previous game has done. For me, there's nothing wrong with sequels sharing similar gameplay styles or very, very similar gameplay elements. After all, a sequel is a sequel. It will share elements that make the game what it is. What makes a good sequel, however, a worthy successor is the ideas it takes from its predecessor and changes them up or improves upon them that were missed out or left in the wayside. Because of just how demanding game development is these days, it's easy to forget that tons of ideas are left forgotten or pushed off to fit more structured and concise release schedules. Some gameplay elements, maybe they're part of the wider gameplay formula of this game, are not what you intended them to be at the end of the day. But sadly, it's too late in development cycle to change it drastically to suit what you and your players might want. So when the sequel is next in line, you can much more easily jump right back in and straight anew from the foundations that the previous game has made. Yet, I don't think you want to delve too far from the norm that has been set, since many players are now expecting a specific style of gameplay that has been known for this game. For example, Breath of the Wild was an open-ended sandbox experience that harbored your own creativity and desire for exploration over everything else. If the next game in the series didn't harbor these tropes, well, I think a fair amount of people would be disappointed, especially so with a direct sequel. Now, before you get your bundles and all whatever, I'm not saying you can't experiment with sequels. In truth, more should, since that's how you come up with new ideas and experiences you never thought could work, and offer a more unique and fun way to experience the same formula that has been laid out. It's more that what you set for your game than anything else, what fans should experience from your game. There has to be a balance between what fans want and what the creativity you find to take it forward. I hope you can already see how deep sequels can be, and I think I'm barely scratching the surface on this. Sequels come in many different forms, from a franchise sense like a Sonic or a Final Fantasy game, to a more direct and inline sequel like a Mass Effect type. Now the gameplay is something I want to talk about much more, specifically about Tears of the Kingdom in its own sense and in terms of being a successor to Breath of the Wild. But before we move on, there is a couple more elements I want to delve into first with sequels that are not related to gameplay. Well, yes, gameplay is one of the core pillars of what a game really is, it's in the name after all. Story as well, and in terms of the themes and narrative ideas are also very important for a sequel. While I said I won't be delving into the story of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom in this video to avoid permanent spoilers, I think it's an element I do want to touch upon overall in terms of a basic sense. Now for a sequel, the story can be a bit more complicated in its scope than gameplay, even with how wild gameplay we've seen sequels can be design-wise. You see, with a story, it is much more related to what type of sequel we are talking about. For one such as Tears of the Kingdom, a direct sequel is much more straightforward. It's more likely than not going to host the same world, settings, and characters. While there might be some deviations in that, and not every game is the same, I think it's more so the rule than the exception in the circumstance. Themes which you might have just noticed I left out on purpose, because I find that themes are much more fluid and not really set in stone between sequels. While there are examples of thematic sequels, something like the Xenoblade series, if you've played them, can be a decent-ish example of that, where many themes are pretty similar and hold relevance between different games, even if they're beholden to different settings and characters. Those themes are very similar in how they're either portrayed and or expressed in their own narrative. Persona is a really actual good example of this, and if you just didn't know, I just made a 2-hour analysis on Persona 5. You should check it out after finishing this video. It took a lot of effort and is by far one of the best videos I have made so far. Anyways, after that plug, Persona offers many thematic similarities between its different games. While how they are expressed can be different, and not all of them are similar in their ideas, it is the fundamental ideas behind them that hold behind each of the different games. Or something like Nier, in which each game is set in the same overall universe, but is very different from each other in a lot of different aspects. And now that I say that, I feel like I have to make videos on the Nier franchise, and I'm really not ready for that at all. Anyways, narrative sequels are very much wider than their counterparts in gameplay. They widely change depending on both what the fans expect and what the developers fear they should do. Similar to gameplay, I guess in that sense, there is a balance between fan expectations and creative expression. Now, I could talk much more about what sequels are overall, but I feel like we should finally delve into an example that is basically what I wanted to talk about and is the star of the show. Tears of the Kingdom is of course the longer-awaited sequel to Breath of the Wild, in terms of gameplay and story expression. Let's finally, I know it's been a long time, let's finally delve into what makes Tears of the Kingdom a sequel, and one that was both well worth the wait and one that deserved the title of a sequel. Tears of the Kingdom is very much placed with the foundation that Breath of the Wild built up in its own development and afterwards. We can see that in the different gameplay elements that have evolved into this game. Ultra Hand, Ascend, Fuse, and Recall. These 4 new powers that have taken the place of the previous powers in Breath of the Wild. Ultra Hand really is the star of the show, and much of the press release material and showcases show off what this ability can do and what it entails for the entire game as a whole. It is pretty fundamentally similar to how Magnesis works, with the ability to pick pick up and drop things wherever you might please, with a much more added element that makes it an entirely new ability, and one that is by far the most creatively engaging one yet. In simple terms, it's a building mechanic. Like Lego pieces, you can place different objects and fuse them to create different structures. To something as simple as a bridge to cross a river, to a boat to cross over, or a hot air balloon that soars above the skies to reach never before seen places. The amount of different ways now that you can just cross a simple bridge has now been expanded to such a degree I couldn't describe them all. Or I wouldn't even want to, since that is the beauty of what makes this mechanic such an interesting one. Only limited by your own creativity and how much you want to try with it. You don't have to be fancy and create a walking mech like some people have now figured out. You can create very simple but functional creations that get you where you need to go simply and easily without worrying about the hassle of it. This is also the problem I have found with it, and I'm sure other people will have found it already with this specific mechanic. It's the constant use of it, and if it can become annoying or will become annoying after a while. Now that isn't a very easy question to just answer, as the answer will be different with basically everyone who plays it. So I think the best I can do right now is both talk about it and give my perspective on it with how it is so far. At first, I was worried off the bat. I'm not really someone who enjoys this mechanic constantly in my face. While I do think it is fun to deal with these type of mechanics, it has to be done in a way that doesn't get repetitive or makes you think in a much more interesting and unique way from the norm that you might have placed yourself into. So far, with about 20 to 40-ish hours, I don't really know at this point, on record, I haven't reached that breaking point yet. But I also haven't been using it everywhere I go. I try to explore and solve puzzles in a much more natural way than forcing myself to use a specific mechanic everywhere I go. And I think that's what the game is expecting and more so wants the player to do. While this mechanic is very overarching and approaches a lot on the different elements of the game, you shouldn't try or feel like it's the only way to succeed in a puzzle, unless it's a shrine, which I do think we'll get into a bit later, but more so something that is a tool that you can use if you feel like you have an idea or a reason to use such tool. It's your own, it's a tool in your arsenal. It's not meant to be a specific mechanic you have to use unless it's a shrine. Ascent and Recall are much more straightforward than Ultra Hand, which is helpful for me, but doesn't make them any more worse than what Ultra Hand can do. Ascent is a very, very helpful ability which you can ascend upwards through a solid walls onto a surface above you. For example, imagine you're in a cave, and without any way to escape, you can just instead easily go right back to the surface and appear right back at the top with just the easy use of Ascend. It is a very basic, but can be used in pretty interesting ways. I so far have found ways I don't think the devs have intended me to use it as, but I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. The game isn't linear in that kind of way. It wants you to explore and experiment with its different mechanics. Ascend is a great representation of that. Recall is pretty similar to how Ascend works, not in terms of the mechanic, but the foundational idea behind it. Recall is the ability to reverse time on a specific object and allow it to slowly go back through time to which it traversed. It's a rather useful ability to get something back that you have lost, like a boat or something that fell that you need to catch again. It's also a really interesting way to reach the new areas in the game, which I will talk about very shortly. Now, Fuse is the second star of the show. We all know Breath of the Wild's more contested element with its gameplay, the weapon durability. Well, it's basically not too dissimilar here, but instead of just randomly picking up new weapons, you can now force two different objects together to form a new weapon. From something as simple as a handmade axe to something like a katana from the remnants of a dead enemy. It is a pretty damn useful ability, and while it is by far one of the more wild and fun elements to the game, it is to me has introduced some problems. But Tears of the Kingdom is both its own game and a sequel to Breath of the Wild. I wanted to give an idea of what Tears of the Kingdom can do by itself, but I think more importantly what it has done with the backbone of Breath of the Wild and what it has done with that. Tears of the Kingdom has gotten much flack for being placed in the same Hyrule as Breath of the Wild. Wow. On the surface, that could be a knock that I think is by far one of the more reasonable critiques we have seen before anything was shown. Now that we're finally be able to play and explore what makes Tears of the Kingdom a new game and a worthwhile sequel, but still not held back by what Breath of the Wild was. Hyrule has changed. it's not the same as before. While yes, the foundational aspects are the same, many additions make Hyrule feel a bit more new and unique from its predecessor in a few ways, with a few areas changing over the years, opening new areas that haven't been explored yet, like in the Goron homelands, or changing drastically what the area was affected by with basically every new major area in the game. But there are some major new additions to the world that make Tears of the Kingdom feel like a new game. It's the Sky Islands, and more importantly to me, the Underground. The Sky Islands were very apparent in the advertisement for this game. It was a major element of the game that was shown multiple times to show how much the new Hyrule was expanded upon. With the sky opened up to explore very meticulously crafted areas to explore, it felt like a new Hyrule was built above. But the depth is where I feel such joy from talking about this new world. It was never talked about in any press, not shown anywhere as far as I was concerned from official press or teasers. The depth has finally opened up due to massive holes in the ground that have appeared due to the new events that have transpired, reaching far, far below the surface of Hyrule, never thought existed till now. A massive, dark, and rather fucking scary place filled with monsters covered in a dark red gloom where you can't see your hands in front of your face. It is for me one of my favorite areas to explore due to just how terrifying and interesting it is to explore. This entirely new and almost Eldritch-like space that encompasses the entirety of Hyrule on the surface. With many sequels and past histories to be found, it is by far one of the most interesting and difficult places to explore. These two areas are what I think is what makes Tears of the Kingdom in terms of its map design a worthwhile sequel to Breath of the Wild. While keeping that foundation that was built intact, it is to me one of the best examples in this game that truly represent this idea. The original Hyrule was the base for the canvas of Tears of the Kingdom. While some might find that boring or lazy even, I find it both a great way to give players who enjoyed Breath of the Wild a way into the world of Tears of the Kingdom and allowed the developers to create two massively explorable areas in the sky and below that are worthwhile in their own ways. Much of the gameplay elements and additions take from what Breath of the Wild did and try to improve upon them, make them more what feels like what was tried in the original game and make them reality. The physics-based puzzles of the original game are now much more in line with more creatively designed user-based physics than more linear designed puzzles. Shrines are also similar to how the world was designed as well. The shrines do feel like they were improved upon in almost every single way. I so far haven't found a shrine that was either annoying to the point of not wanting to play it or anything really in between. Almost all of them were fun, but some did get to the point where they were kind of boring, but none of them were really bad. While many of them really harbor on the new Ultra Hand mechanic, they are designed in a more fun way than I felt like was done in Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild does have really good shrines, but it also had some lackluster ones and some really awful ones spread in there. I can't be the only one that hated the gyro puzzles. And I haven't done all the puzzles and shrines in Breath of the Wild or in Tears of the Kingdom so far, so I can't really say for certain how Tears of the Kingdom does, but I have done a fair amount of them in Breath of the Wild, and I have done a fair amount of them in Tears of the Kingdom so far. And so far, on either one, I think so far, Tears of the Kingdom has done a worthwhile job of improving upon what Breath of the Wild did with its shrines. And I do feel like they learned something and had experience from making these type of experiences in the past. An actual evolution that was seen in this specific design aspect. It does feel like Tears of the Kingdom has opened up the world of Breath of the Wild to allow players to feel more connected and feel more in tune with the world as a whole. Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, if you think it's worth being a sequel or it shouldn't exist is more up to you as a person. But how this specific game has both changed and fundamentally kept to the same beat as Breath of the Wild is a testament to good game design and worthwhile sequel development. Of course, it has problems with its rather lackluster performance, which I feel like is more of a problem of the Switch than the game itself. But even with that, somehow it feels like it performs better than some AAA games coming out today. It does feel like it's both its own game and something that builds upon what was sowed in the past. It is pretty easy to tell it took 6 years to develop with how long modern game development is taking these days, and with the amount of new content, in addition to these already really solid gameplay experiences. Do I think it's perfect or a masterpiece? No. But do I think it's a sequel that is worth the praise and sets upon improving and directing the foundation of what was set in the past in a better and more unique light? Yes. It is what a sequel should strive to achieve. A way to experience new ways of playing a very similar style with new additions and quality of life changes that both improve the already given experience and make it more unique for returning players. All sequels are different in their own ways. Categorizing them is not something many people do or even think about, but Tears of the Kingdom is what a sequel should be.